Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Monday, the 17th, where we took a little bit of a break from Dracula because I wanted you to see a lecture from Professor David Puntner. Now, Professor Puntner is one of the leading scholars in Gothic literature, and I think you can tell from his lecture. And if you search YouTube, you can see that there are lots of other pieces that you can listen to. I chose the piece that I chose just because of length. It was the shortest one that I was able to find that still did a fairly good job of talking about some of the major themes and issues that we've talked about in this class. And in fact, I've used some of his work for putting together this particular course. So we're at the point now where many of the texts that he mentioned are texts that are familiar to you. And in fact, we are at the point in the semester where we're going to be doing a shift into some more contemporary pieces. But first, to finish up with Dracula, today's attendance question is going to be revisiting that text and having you identify important quotes from the text and why you think they're important. I'll get back to that in a moment. In terms of paper number 1, I have completed grading all of the papers that were submitted in October. So now I'm working on those that have been submitted in after the fact. As I say, you're in the queue. So if you haven't received your paper and you submitted it in October, please contact me because that means that an error has been made somewhere along the line. And as you know, paper number 2 is going to be very similar to paper number 1, the distinction being that you're writing about one of the later texts in the semester. And certainly Dracula can be one of those texts, but in terms of some of the more contemporary pieces, we are beginning with H.P. Lovecraft. And you'll remember H.P. Lovecraft because we began the semester by talking about Lovecraft and Stephen King. And we were talking about Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, which is considered to be one of the standards in terms of laying out the foundation of Gothic literature. So I thought it would be interesting to read a couple of his short stories and to see whether or not he's able to maintain some of the elements that he discusses as being ideal in the Gothic tradition. A little bit of bio about Lovecraft. He came from poor health and there was a history of dementia in his family. Notice how we have histories of writers where they seem to have health and or mental challenges. And that seems to make sense considering the subject matter of the Gothic. Known for being a New Englander. And if you think about the idea of the New England, we talked about this with Edgar Allan Poe, the Gothic tradition moving from England to New England, which was settled by basically British and the Puritans in particular, and Rhode Island, New England, and in general, this whole area is viewed as, at least from Lovecraft's perspective, having lots of supernatural elements associated with it, in part because of the decadence and inbreeding associated with the area. And I've always been conflicted about Lovecraft. He's never been my favorite author, to be quite honest with you. I know there are some Lovecraft aficionados who follow his work quite religiously. And one of Lovecraft's claims to fame is that he basically created an entire world, almost like Tolkien, if you want to think about it that way. And there are people who are avid followers of the world that he created that mimics in part New England. That's one of his greatest strengths, is being able to use new locales, or old locales, I should say, from New England, but be able to link them up with new locales that he has associated with the supernatural. So he oftentimes talks about Miskatonic University, and Miskatonic University is modeled after Harvard University, for instance. And Miskatonic University is supposed to house one of the most dangerous supernatural books that exists, the Necronomicon. And there's lots of myth building associated with the Necronomicon, so much so that there are readers who are convinced that it is real and actually have been searching for it in bookstores. And of course, this is a fictional element of Lovecraft's fictional world, but he does such a good job of mimicking realism that it seems as if it actually exists. And perhaps Lovecraft's biggest claim to fame is Cthulhu, which is supposed to be this monstrosity that honestly can't even be pronounced by the human tongue. So Cthulhu is basically the closest that we're able to get. And most of his stories appeared in Weird magazine and Weird Tales magazine. And he was basically a cult figure after his death. Very common for authors to achieve a certain level of status, not during their lifetime, but after their lifetime. So he definitely shows an Anglophile disposition. He has a preoccupation with Britain, with old things, with astronomy. And again, one of the reasons why I feel conflicted about Lovecraft is because of his anti-foreign sentiment. His xenophobia is pretty clear, especially in his early writings. Towards the latter part of his career, he revisited some of those beliefs that he had. So there was a progression and a growth over the course of his lifetime. Our narrators are oftentimes scientists and scholars, and he will mix Gothic and sci-fi. We talked about how genre blending oftentimes happens in the Gothic. Very much inspired by Edgar Allan Poe, trying to mimic many of the qualities of Edgar Allan Poe, and would have twist endings much like Poe and short stories do. One of the things that I dislike about Lovecraft, to be quite honest with you, is how heavy-handed he can be with his twist endings. He makes sure to put them in italics so that it's impossible to miss what's happening. You will see that he has lots of prose rhythms and oftentimes include poetic elements. We saw that with Edgar Allan Poe as well. Utilizing dramatic tension and foreshadowing. And I gave you just 3 of his short stories to review, but I think that with just those 3, you can get a good sense of his writing style. My favorite, perhaps being the first that I had assigned, being The Outsider, which begins with a quote by Keats from the great Romantic tradition. So there is this literary element of Lovecraft. We have an I narrator. This should sound familiar from Edgar Allan Poe. We definitely have the Gothic atmosphere of what appears to be a castle. It's twilight, there's a full moon, there's graveyard, there's isolation. We talk about monster, and of course, monstrare in Latin means to show or reveal. And the monster is representative of the other or the outsider. And of course, the twist is that there's consciousness and death. And perhaps that's the biggest horror, is that one could be dead and not realize that one is dead. So we find out that our narrator is not narrating from a castle, he's narrating from a crypt, and our narrator has already died and is a corpse. And of course, when he makes his way to the heavens, really what he's doing is making his way to the surface. And as he approaches a dinner party that reminds me very much of the Masque of Red Death, of course, he sees his reflection, that idea of doubling that we oftentimes see in the Gothic, the doppelganger. Or, of course, we could talk about that the Gothic is really just a reflection of our fears and anxieties, which is something that I talk about in not only this class, but in my horror film class. And, of course, the twist ending there. And Pickman's model plays on the long literary tradition of linking the arts with the supernatural. If we had time, we would be reading The Picture of Dorian Gray, which is a terrific novel. And this sense of putting Pickman's model right in the heart of Boston so that, again, it feels very realistic. With the narrator, Thurber, who is maintaining that he's sane. If this sounds familiar, it should. This is Edgar Allan Poe. And of course, we find out about an ancient evil. And how many times in the Gothic have we seen that it's impossible to put to rest the ancient past and the sins of the ancient past? The associations with the supernatural are references to things like Salem, witches, vampirism, and Lovecraft loves to talk about the suspension of nature's laws, which is really or one of the definitions of the supernatural. According to Lovecraft, one of the gateways to the supernatural world was through angles. So you had to be very careful with angles. And think about this when we read The Haunting of Hill House. We talk about that. In this text, we also see a kind of reverse evolution, which is something that we talked about with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with, again, the twist ending that it turns out the monstrosity that Pickman is painting is not fictional. It's basically a realistic portrait, which is how the narrator discovers the truth by seeing an actual photograph that the narrator took. And of course, things like tunnels and subways and labyrinths are other ways in which the supernatural can enter into the natural world. And then our last piece, Dunwich Horror, I wanted to assign because it gives a little bit of a sense of the mythos building that Lovecraft is so well known for. In fact, you'll see some of his characters returning in other stories. And in fact, in one of his pieces, he even mentions Greenfield, Massachusetts as one of the train stops. So again, that's part of the fun, especially if you're a New Englander and reading Lovecraft. And what we find in the opening sentence is this idea of archetypes. So in many ways, Lovecraft was quite Jungian in a sense of these ancient elements that help to form our personalities and help to form our world. From Lovecraft's perspective, they're ancient evils. It's divided up into multiple sections, and we've certainly seen this technique before utilized in other Gothic texts. Even though it's a short story, it's the longest of the 3 short stories. It occurs in north central Massachusetts, Dunwich, where we're given a Dr. Armitage, who's a kind of Van Helsing figure, someone who is able to mix both science and the supernatural. And it talks about things like abnormality, inbreeding, degeneracy, decadence. One of my favorite lines is, quote, "The natives are repellently decadent in their path of retrogression in many New England backwaters." So I guess you could think about the hill towns in some respect. And even still, I suppose there is this element of snobbery from eastern Massachusetts towards western Massachusetts. Of course, he talks about Miskatonic University, which I had indicated is modeled after the great Ivy Leagues. For our purposes, it would be closest probably to Harvard, just in terms of geographic location. And making reference to what's known as the Arkham Advertiser and some of the newspaper articles they have about the event, which are supposed to mimic basically the idea behind the Boston Globe. And references again to the supernatural, lots of pagan holidays, Candlemas, May Eve, Halloween, which we talked about in our Halloween class, black magic, the Necronomicon, which is one of the ways that you can access this ancient evil, the whippoorwill. So if you weren't aware of some of the folklore associated with the bird, the whippoorwill, they're supposed to be harbingers of death. The common Lovecraftian question is who or what is the monster? And what we oftentimes find is that the monster is ourselves. This has been a common theme throughout the Gothic. Certainly, it's a theme in The Outsider about what makes, ultimately monstrosity, that we ourselves are the monstrosity. The thing with Lovecraft is that he doesn't provide the ambiguity that many of the other authors that we've read thus far do. He is very clear that the supernatural exists. Certainly there could be a psychological element, but with someone like Poe, one could go in one of either direction, either psychological or supernatural, and I suggest both. But in Lovecraft, it is very, very clear that the supernatural exists, and he will show us the supernatural. Lots of detailed description of monstrosity. Sometimes it can be a little bit tried and cliche. He likes to use the term green ichor, for instance, quite frequently. Something that's partly human but partly not human. That's part of the element of the uncanny that we've talked about. Something that seems familiar but yet unfamiliar at the same time. And in this particular instance, this monstrosity has a leathery hide and greenish gray tentacles. He oftentimes talks about the sea as one of the origins for where monstrosity occurs, the sea being the ocean. This sectioned out piece is in part a diary entry. And of course, we've seen this technique before, the epistolary novel. So we're at the point now where we see authors who are paying homage to previous Gothic writers. And we're given three male scientists. We know that Poe's world is very male. And in fact, we talked about other worlds being very male as well, with Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Even with Frankenstein, though I think that the message of Frankenstein, in part, is that what happens when you exclude female. And talking about Frankenstein, I did see the Guillermo del Toro version, and it's now streaming on Netflix. I was fortunate enough to be able to see it in the movie theater before it was basically retired for Netflix. I must admit that I wasn't terribly impressed. The reviews I've read, initially being quite glowing, have turned more mixed. They obviously, as is the right of any film director, made changes to the text. I personally don't necessarily agree with some of the changes that are made, but if you are going to see Frankenstein, I'd be curious to know what you think about that particular production. That said, the acting was superb in my opinion, and the sets and the cinematography breathtaking. I just wish that the storytelling had been different. But again, I don't want to give away too many spoilers if you haven't seen Frankenstein. But to say that in the end, I think I prefer the 1930s version is, I think, probably accurate. Though I've been encouraged by others to rewatch the film and to see if I have a different impression of it upon a rewatching, which is possible, but I don't think probable. Going back to Lovecraft, we find out that the real monster is not Wilbur Whately, but his twin brother. The idea again of the doubling, and the ending line, perhaps a moral to all of us, or one of the ending lines: we have no business calling in such things from the outside, and only very wicked people and very wicked cults ever try to. Now, if you are a fan of the great radio dramas, which were known for actually telling supernatural horror, you might be interested in this audiobook link that I have posted in our fourth section, Chilling Tales for Nights. And it is about the Dunwich Horror. It takes close to 2 hours, an hour and 56 minutes to read and dramatize that particular short story. It's nothing that you're required to do, but in the tradition of the great radio plays, if you sit in a dark room and you let your imagination wander as you're listening to these tales, it can be quite an effective environment in terms of bringing forth, if not horror, at least terror. And we had talked about some of the ways that Stephen King makes the distinction between them. And Stephen King's not the only one. And in the lecture on the Gothic, he also talked a little bit, he being Professor Punter, about the distinction between horror and terror as well. So the next text that's coming up is The Haunting of Hill House. And it's one of my favorite texts. We've got a female author, and while we had that with Shirley Jackson, we haven't had that in a while. Though, of course, with the lecture on the Gothic, you heard a little bit about some of the female authors from the 1800s, and while their writing can be somewhat interesting, they probably aren't texts that are as literary as the texts that we're talking about. And that said, The Haunting of Hill House is a mastery in suggestion, and you might know the author, the Shirley Jackson, for her famous short story, The Lottery. If you haven't read it, I encourage you to. All I want to say is that it's a lottery you do not want to win, and I'll leave it at that. And one of the things that Shirley Jackson, I think, quite effectively does is utilize many of the elements of the English ghost story. And remember, we talked a little bit about the English ghost story during Halloween, and specifically we had talked about Monkey's Paw. But of course, there are lots of English ghost stories that are out there, and Shirley Jackson, another New Englander, this time from Vermont, is utilizing that great tradition in The Haunting of Hill House. And I think what you will find in this text is that the language is much more accessible. So Lovecraft, for instance, is definitely trying to duplicate much of the language and the syntax associated with Old England. And certainly we get that in texts such as Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Frankenstein. In fact, if you ordered one of the textbooks that I believe I had listed as recommended, it puts all three of those major seminal works together: Frankenstein, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula, with an introduction from Stephen King. Not that you necessarily have to read that particular edition. There are lots of editions. And as you can see, I've also provided you with web links. So you've got the web link for Lovecraft, and you also have the web link for Shirley Jackson. But I think that you will find it's a much more accessible text. And we've got a central female character, which is something that's quite new. And we'll talk a little bit more about the traditions of ghosts and haunting and so forth next class. Our attendance question, going back to that, which will be due Wednesday on the 19th for the discussion forum, is for you to identify an important quote in Dracula and talk a little bit about why you think it's important. I've fallen a little bit behind with my responses to the discussion forum, so I've been working on papers for various classes, but I plan on catching up soon. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers in the discussion forums, but you are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn. And that will give you a good idea of what we talked about in the class discussion. So what we will do is put some closure onto Lovecraft next class. So where you should be in the semester is you should have finished Dracula by now. You'll notice that I gave you a little bit of extra time at the beginning of our Dracula unit when we were talking about Halloween, and the Halloween being the holiday, that is, and not necessarily the film Halloween. That's for my film class. And I gave you a little bit of extra time at the ending by your listening to a lecture on the Gothic, so you can get an idea of how academics treat the subject matter. So if you haven't finished Dracula, that is your assignment right now, to finish Dracula. And we have 3 Lovecraft short stories. Again, the longest being the Dunwich Horror, but I think you'll see that these are much shorter texts than Dracula, which is the longest text of the semester. And then Shirley Jackson, and we've got several classes devoted to The Haunting of Hill House. So this would be a wonderful opportunity for you to catch up and begin thinking about paper number 2. And whether you decide to rewrite paper number 1 or not, you all have the option to do that. And if I haven't returned paper number 1 yet to you because you submitted it in November, I certainly shall be returning paper number 1 soon. You have up until the ending of the semester to submit in that revision, so you've got some time. But whether or not you decide to do a revision, and if you did do a revision, I ask that you hand in the original with my commentary along with your revised version. You would have the higher of the 2 grades. But whether you revise or not, you should read my comments carefully, and you should apply those suggestions to paper number 2. And I'm well aware that my handwriting is sometimes not the easiest to decipher. So if it turns out there's a comment that you can't read, please let me know. You can take a screenshot of it, or you can direct me to where it is in your paper, and I can decipher for you. And certainly if you wanted further suggestions on how to proceed with writing, just reach out to me and we can always make an appointment. So again, our discussion forum response, and if you need an extension, please let me know, to identify an important quote in Dracula, why you think it's important. We'll finish up with Lovecraft next class, and we'll talk about The Haunting of Hill House. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.